It's around 2600 BCE, and a man named Imhotep is standing in front of Pharaoh Djoser with a proposal that, by every reasonable standard of the time, should have gotten him laughed out of the room. Today, we're going over some of the most brilliant people in history, the ones who essentially shaped the entire world and then got completely written out of it. And we're starting with a guy who was, by almost any measure, the first true genius in recorded human history. Imhotep was not born into royalty. He was a commoner, which in ancient Egypt meant your ceiling was very, very low. And yet somehow he climbed all the way to the position of vizier, the second most powerful man in the entire kingdom, serving directly under Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty. That alone is a remarkable story, but what he actually did while he was there is the part that should have kept his name in every history textbook ever written. The proposal he is walking into that throne room with is this: instead of building the pharaoh's tomb out of mud brick like everyone had done for hundreds of years before, he wants to build it out of stone. Stacked stone. Massive, carefully cut limestone blocks arranged in a series of ascending platforms, each one smaller than the one below it, rising up out of the desert in a shape nobody had ever seen before. This is the step pyramid at Saqqara, and it is the first large-scale stone structure in human history. Before Imhotep, the standard burial monument was a mastaba, a low, flat-roofed rectangular tomb made out of mud brick. Perfectly functional. Also, not exactly awe-inspiring. What Imhotep built instead stood about 62 meters tall and could be seen from miles away across the desert. The workers constructing it had never done anything remotely like this before. Nobody had. Imhotep was essentially inventing monumental architecture from scratch and supervising its construction at the same time, which is kind of insane when you think about it. But here's the thing that I find genuinely shocking about this guy. Architecture was apparently just his side project. Imhotep was also at the same time one of the most advanced medical practitioners of the ancient world. There's an ancient text called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which is essentially a surgical handbook, and it describes 48 cases of injuries and ailments with detailed, rational, clinical observations about how to treat them. No magic spells, no prayers to the gods, just careful diagnosis, systematic examination, and practical treatment. Things like how to set a broken bone, how to close a wound, how to recognize when an injury is too severe to treat and tell the patient honestly. For 2600 BCE, this is extraordinary. This is the foundation of evidence-based medicine, and Imhotep is the guy most historians now credit with writing it, or at least originating the tradition it came from. He was so respected during his lifetime, and so completely legendary in the centuries after his death, that the Egyptians eventually just gave up trying to describe him as a person and made him a god instead. He became the god of medicine and healing, worshipped for 2,000 years after he died, with temples built in his honor and people traveling from across the ancient world to pray to him for cures. That is a genuinely remarkable legacy. The problem is that when Western scholars first encountered the Edwin Smith Papyrus in the 19th century, they didn't believe a single man from 2600 BCE could possibly have written something so sophisticated, so they assumed it must have been the work of later anonymous authors. His actual contributions got buried under centuries of mythology and misattribution. Eventually, the Egyptians stopped calling him a man altogether and made him a god, which is one way to be remembered, just not necessarily the accurate one. In the early 1940s, if you asked anyone in America who Hedy Lamarr was, they'd tell you she was the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. That would be the entire answer. She was MGM's biggest star. She was reportedly the face that animators studied when they designed Snow White. She was so constantly photographed that her image was basically inescapable, if you opened a magazine anywhere in the United States. That was the whole story, as far as the public was concerned. Nobody knew that she was going home after long days on set and sitting down at a drafting table to work through an engineering problem that the United States military hadn't been able to solve. The problem she was trying to fix was this. During World War II, the Allies were using radio signals to guide torpedoes toward their targets. The Germans had figured out that if you jammed the radio frequency the torpedo was listening to, the whole thing went stupid and missed. Lamarr, who had been married to an Austrian arms dealer before she fled to America in the late 1930s, had actually sat in on enough of those business meetings to understand exactly how the jamming worked, and she thought she knew how to stop it. The idea she developed, together with a composer named George Antheil, was called frequency hopping. Instead of transmitting on one fixed frequency the whole time, the guidance signal would jump rapidly between dozens of different frequencies in a pattern that both the transmitter and the receiver knew in advance. A jammer trying to block one frequency would only knock out a tiny fraction of the signal before it had already moved on to the next one. Antheil had actually worked out a similar synchronization system for player pianos, which sounds completely unrelated. But the mechanical logic was essentially the same, and together they filed a patent in 1942. I'm so genuinely baffled by what happened next. They handed this patent to the United States Navy. The Navy looked at it, looked at Hedy Lamarr, the movie star, and told her the best way she could help the war effort was to sell war bonds. Which she did, because what else was she going to do? The patent sat in a drawer. It expired in 1959, 17 years after she filed it, without anyone in the military ever implementing it in a meaningful way. She never saw a cent from it. Jump forward about 40 years. It's the early 1990s, and engineers working on what would eventually become Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are working through the mathematics of how to transmit wireless data reliably without interference. And they kept arriving at the same solution. Spread the signal across multiple frequencies. Hop between them in a synchronized pattern. It was Lamarr's patent. Essentially rebuilt from scratch because nobody building these systems had any idea she'd already worked it out. By the time the electronics industry figured out that she had been there first. The patent had been expired for decades, and there was no legal mechanism to compensate her for anything. She got an award from the Electronic Frontier Foundation in 1997, 3 years before she died. She said on the phone when they told her, because she wasn't going out much by that point, "It's about time," which is either a great line or a genuinely heartbreaking one, depending on how you're feeling about it. She spent most of her final years in near total seclusion in Florida. The technology industry that owed an enormous debt to her work was mostly occupied with not thinking about her. She died in 2000, somewhere in the world at that exact moment. Thousands of people were using wireless technology built on math she'd figured out 60 years earlier. Sometime in the late 1840s, a man named Benjamin Bradley is sitting in a workshop at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, quietly building a steam engine out of garbage. And I mean that literally. He's working with a pewter spoon, scraps of metal, pieces salvaged from guns, materials he had no real business having access to in the first place. Bradley is enslaved, assigned to the science department as an assistant, and whatever he's building it on his own time, in whatever moments he can carve out, without anyone particularly paying attention to what he's doing. What he ends up with is not a curiosity. It's not a miniature novelty or a proof of concept that kind of works if you squint. When Bradley finishes his steam engine, it's powerful enough to drive a Navy sloop at 16 knots. That's a real number. That's a functional, serious piece of engineering that could move a warship. And he built the first version of it out of scraps on a workbench at a school that didn't consider him a person in the legal sense of the word. His owner eventually sells the engine, which is the part of this story I find completely infuriating, but he does let Bradley keep a portion of the profits. And Bradley, being extraordinarily careful and extraordinarily patient, saves every cent of that money. He uses it to buy his own freedom, which again is a thing that had to happen. A man who had just engineered a working naval steam engine had to purchase himself like an object, because that is what the law said he was. Here's the part that really gets me, though. Bradley could never patent the invention. Not because he didn't try or didn't know how, the law simply did not allow it. In the 1850s, enslaved people were considered property, which meant that legally, every idea they had, everything they built, every innovation that came out of their minds belonged to their owner. There was no mechanism by which Bradley could stand up and say, "This is mine." The engine he built with his own hands, with his own understanding of physics and mechanics and engineering, vanished from his name entirely. It was sold, it was used, and somewhere in the official record it became an asset with no inventor attached to it. This wasn't unusual. Bradley's situation was one version of something that happened to an unknown number of enslaved people throughout American history. We know about Bradley at all only because a few records survived. How many didn't? How many engines, techniques, inventions, and solutions just got absorbed into someone else's property ledger and disappeared? It's one of those questions where the honest answer is we have no idea, and the honest answer is also kind of horrible. What's strange about Bradley's story is that it doesn't even end dramatically. There's no confrontation, no moment of public recognition, no long-delayed vindication. He built something remarkable, he saved his money, and he bought his freedom. That's the whole arc. After he bought his freedom, Benjamin Bradley walked out of the historical record entirely, and nobody has found a trace of him since. In 1938, Lise Meitner boarded a train out of Nazi Germany with a diamond ring sewn into her coat that Otto Hahn had given her in case she needed to bribe someone at the border. She had spent 30 years building one of the most distinguished careers in European physics, and she was leaving with a hidden piece of jewelry and 10 marks in her pocket because the country she'd lived in for most of her adult life had decided she wasn't a person anymore. The Nazis had passed laws stripping Austrian Jews of their citizenship, and Meitner, who had been protected somewhat by her Austrian passport up to that point, was now exposed. Her colleagues spent weeks quietly arranging her escape route. To understand how extraordinary this moment is, you have to back up a little. Meitner had arrived in Berlin in 1907 with a physics doctorate from the University of Vienna, one of the very few women in Europe who had managed to get one. The physics establishment in Berlin barely tolerated her. Max Planck, whose work on quantum theory she deeply admired, initially told her women had no place in serious science. She spent her first years at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, working in a converted carpentry workshop because she wasn't allowed into the main building. And despite all of this, she stayed, because the work mattered more than the humiliation, which is either admirable or heartbreaking depending on how you look at it. She partnered with chemist Otto Hahn, and together they worked for decades on radioactive elements, building a genuine scientific friendship that produced real results. In 1917, they discovered protactinium, a new element which alone would have been enough to make most careers. But the collaboration kept going, and by the late 1930s they were doing experiments bombarding uranium with neutrons and getting results that didn't make sense. The uranium nuclei were splitting. Something enormous was happening in their data, and they hadn't quite named it yet. Then came the escape. Meitner crossed into the Netherlands and eventually made it to Sweden, where she had been offered a position at a research institute in Stockholm. The institute was understaffed and underfunded, and nothing like what she'd had in Berlin, but she was alive. She and Hahn kept corresponding by letter, and in December of 1938, while visiting her nephew, the physicist Otto Frisch, She took a walk through the snow near Gothenburg, and they talked through the physics of what the uranium experiments had actually shown. They worked out the mathematics right there, in the cold, on a walk, calculating the energy that would be released when a nucleus split. She even gave it a name, borrowing a term from biology, fission. Nuclear fission. One of the most consequential scientific concepts of the entire 20th century, worked out by a refugee physicist doing calculations in the Swedish snow. The paper they published in early 1939 laid out the theoretical framework that the entire Manhattan Project would eventually build on. Meitner herself refused to participate in bomb development when she was approached by American scientists, which is a whole separate thing worth thinking about. She kept working in Sweden, kept publishing, kept corresponding with colleagues across the world, and in 1944, the Nobel Committee awarded the prize for the discovery of nuclear fission to Otto Hahn. Alone, Meitner's name was not mentioned. Hahn accepted it without publicly crediting her in any meaningful way, which is something their friendship apparently never fully recovered from. He did nominate her for the prize multiple times in the years that followed, to his credit. She was nominated a total of 48 times across her career and never won. When the committee's internal deliberations were made public in the 1990s, it turned out they had simply failed to understand the theoretical contribution she had made, which is an astounding thing to discover about the people handing out the most prestigious award in science. She died in 1968, 3 days before her 90th birthday. Her gravestone says she was a physicist who never lost her humanity, which is a lovely thing to put on the grave of someone the Nobel Committee decided wasn't worth the prize. In 132 CE, a man named Zhang Heng walked into the imperial court of the Eastern Han Dynasty and presented the emperor with what looked, to most people in the room, like a very fancy decorative urn. It was not a decorative urn. It was the world's first seismoscope, and Zhang Heng had built it entirely on his own, without any prior framework to work from, in a century when the dominant explanation for earthquakes was essentially that the ground was angry. The device was a large bronze vessel, roughly the size of a wine barrel, with 8 dragon heads arranged around the outside of it, each one holding a small bronze ball in its mouth. Below each dragon sat a bronze toad, mouth open, waiting. Inside the vessel, a central pendulum mechanism sat perfectly balanced, designed to swing in the direction of any seismic disturbance. When an earthquake struck, the pendulum would shift, trigger a series of levers, and one of the 8 dragons would release its ball directly into the mouth of the toad below it, landing with a loud, ringing clang that could be heard across the room. The direction the dragon faced told you the direction the earthquake had come from. I mean, that is genuinely one of the coolest things I have ever heard in my life. The court was skeptical. Understandably so, honestly. And then, one day, the device went off. One of the dragons dropped its ball, pointing due west. The problem was that nobody in the capital, Luoyang, had felt anything. No shaking, no tremors, nothing. The officials who witnessed it were pretty openly dismissive, and some of them apparently made their opinions known. Then, a few days later, a messenger arrived from the western provinces reporting that a massive earthquake had devastated the region of Longxi, several hundred miles away, in exactly the direction the dragon had pointed. The room went silent. Zhang Heng had just detected an earthquake from hundreds of miles away with a bronze jar and a pendulum, weeks before anyone could ride a horse fast enough to bring the news in person. The thing that gets me is that this happened in 132 CE. The Western world wouldn't produce a comparable instrument until the 1700s. That's 15 centuries of gap, and Zhang Heng was operating without any scientific tradition of seismology to draw from, in a political environment where the main job of a court astronomer was to interpret celestial signs for the emperor, not to build mechanical earthquake detectors. He did it anyway, because that is apparently just the kind of person he was. And earthquake detection was far from the only thing on his resume. Zhang Heng had already built an improved armillary sphere, a bronze mechanical model used to track the positions of celestial bodies, and he did it with a level of accuracy that genuinely impressed the astronomers who came after him. He calculated pi to a more precise value than any Western mathematician had managed at the time. He wrote poetry and prose that's still read and studied in China today. He produced work on cartography. He was the grand historian, the chief astronomer, and at various points one of the most important scholars in the entire Han court. The guy was not doing any one thing. He was doing everything, all at once, at an extraordinarily high level. Outside of China, his name is almost completely unknown. There's a crater on the moon named after him, and an asteroid, which is a nice gesture but also kind of highlights how little most people can tell you about who he actually was. Europe wouldn't build anything like it for another 1,500 years, but you probably didn't hear about Zhang Heng in school, so in 1951, Rosalind Franklin arrived at King's College London as one of the best X-ray crystallographers alive, and the very first problem she encountered was that her colleague Morris Wilkins seemed to think she was his assistant. She was not. She had been hired as an independent researcher to lead her own work on DNA, full stop. Wilkins had apparently not gotten that memo, or chosen to ignore it, and the two of them spent the next couple of years in a working relationship that, by all accounts, was genuinely miserable for everyone involved. Franklin was methodical, precise, and not particularly interested in guessing at conclusions before the data was there to support them. She just wanted to do the work, and the work she was doing was extraordinary. By 1952, Franklin had become so skilled at X-ray diffraction photography that she was producing images of DNA no one had ever seen before. The technique works by firing X-rays at a crystallized sample and recording the pattern they make when they scatter off the structure. If you know what you're looking at, those patterns tell you the shape of the molecule. In May of 1952, she captured an image that would later become one of the most famous photographs in the history of science. It's called Photo 51, and to anyone trained in crystallography, it was essentially a picture of the double helix sitting right there in black and white. Franklin knew it was significant. She was working through exactly what it meant. She never got the chance to finish that work first. Wilkins showed Photo 51 to James Watson without Franklin's knowledge and without her permission. Watson later admitted in his book that the instant he saw it, he understood immediately what he was looking at. The dimensions of the helix, the angles, the spacing, it was all there. He and Francis Crick, who were working on their own model of DNA at Cambridge, had been somewhat stuck. After seeing Franklin's image, they weren't stuck anymore. Watson and Crick published their model of the DNA double helix in April of 1953 in Nature. It is one of the most celebrated papers in scientific history. In the same issue, Franklin's own papers were published alongside it, but they were framed as supporting data, as though her work was simply there to back up the model Watson and Crick had built. The reality was closer to the opposite. Their model was built on her data. The acknowledgement she received in that paper was so minimal that most people reading it at the time had no idea how central her contribution actually was. Franklin left King's College that same year and moved to Birkbeck, where she spent the next several years doing genuinely brilliant work on the structure of viruses. By most accounts, she was happier there, away from the whole situation, and her colleagues at Birkbeck remembered her as warm and funny and collaborative, which is a bit of a contrast to how Watson would later describe her. In 1956, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She died in April of 1958 at 37 years old. Some researchers have pointed out that years of working closely with X-ray equipment likely didn't help, though that's never been definitively confirmed. She was 37. She never knew what had been done with her photograph. Or, if she suspected, she never said so publicly. 4 years later, in 1962, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of the double helix. The Nobel is not awarded posthumously, so Franklin's death made her ineligible regardless of any other consideration. Whether she would have been included had she lived is a question that scientists and historians have been arguing about for decades, and nobody has a clean answer. Watson, Crick, and Wilkins shared the Nobel Prize in 1962, and the book Watson later wrote about the whole thing is, by most accounts, one of the more unflattering portraits of a dead colleague in the history of science. In 1895, Jagadish Chandra Bose stood in front of a crowd in Calcutta and used invisible waves of energy to ring a bell on the other side of a wall, which, by any measure, should have made him one of the most famous scientists in the world. He didn't, and I find that genuinely baffling. Bose was a Bengali scientist working at Presidency College in Calcutta under British colonial rule, and the institution started him off being paid literally less than his British colleagues for doing the exact same job. He refused his salary for 3 years in protest, which is an insane thing to have to do, and eventually the college caved and paid him properly. He also had to fight tooth and nail just to get access to a laboratory. So the circumstances were already working hard against this guy before he even got started. Despite all of that, by the mid-1890s, Bose was producing research in microwave physics and wireless signal transmission that nobody else in the world was close to matching. The 1895 demonstration in Calcutta was not a small thing. He used millimeter-length radio waves to remotely ring a bell and set off a small explosion on the other side of a wall. The crowd watched it happen in real time. This is wireless transmission, demonstrated publicly and documented, years before Guglielmo Marconi made his famous transatlantic signal in 1901, the one that supposedly launched the entire era of radio communication. Marconi gets a statue. Marconi gets the Nobel Prize in 1909. Marconi goes down in basically every history book as the father of radio. Here's the part that makes me want to put my head through a wall. Bose didn't patent his work. Almost none of it. He had this deeply held belief that scientific knowledge belonged to everyone, that discoveries should be shared openly and freely rather than locked up behind patents for personal profit. So he published his findings, gave public lectures explaining exactly how his devices worked, and handed the information to the world with both hands. And Marconi, who was building commercial wireless telegraphy at the exact same time and absolutely knew about Bose's work, used it. The specific receiver that Marconi relied on during several of his most celebrated demonstrations was based directly on a device Bose had invented. Bose knew this was happening. He did not seem to particularly care, because his whole philosophy was that science was supposed to move forward, not sit in a filing cabinet waiting for a royalty check. It is very admirable. It is also a catastrophic own goal in terms of getting credit for anything. After his wireless work, Bose pivoted into plant physiology, which is not a pivot most people would see coming. He spent years building incredibly sensitive instruments to measure electrical responses in plants, and essentially proved that plants respond to stimuli the same way animals do, that they have something functioning like a nervous system, that they react to pain and pleasure and temperature and light in measurable, documentable ways. This was genuinely revolutionary science. In India, he became a celebrated national figure, a symbol of what Indian science could accomplish against every institutional barrier stacked against it. In Western science history, he is a footnote, if that. He was eventually knighted and made a Fellow of the Royal Society, which are both very impressive honors and also did basically nothing for his name recognition outside of India. In 1948, a mathematician at Bell Labs named Claude Shannon published a paper that, if you work in engineering or computer science, you treat almost like a religious text. If you don't, you've probably never heard of. The paper was called A Mathematical Theory of Communication, and what Shannon did in it was genuinely hard to overstate. Before Shannon, nobody had a rigorous way to think about information itself as a measurable thing. He figured out that information has a mathematical structure the same way mass or energy does, that you could quantify how much uncertainty exists in a message, how much of that message is redundant, how efficiently you could compress it and transmit it through a noisy channel without losing what actually mattered. He named the fundamental unit of information a bit, which is a word every person alive today uses constantly without having any idea where it came from. Every text message you send, every phone call, every streaming video, every piece of data moving through any wire or wirelessly anywhere in the world right now is operating on the framework Shannon built in that single paper. I find it genuinely baffling that this man is not a household name. And here's the thing. Shannon wasn't some grim, solitary genius grinding away in a basement somewhere. By all accounts, he was one of the more delightfully weird people to ever work in American science. He roller skated down the hallways of Bell Labs while juggling, which, fine, a lot of mathematicians are a little odd. But Shannon also built a flame-throwing trumpet. He built a chess-playing machine at a time when that was considered basically science fiction. He built something he called the ultimate machine. That was a box with a single switch on it. When you flipped the switch on, a small mechanical hand would emerge from the box, flip the switch back off, and retreat inside. That was the entire function of the device. He was so pleased with this that he built multiple versions and gave them away as gifts. I'm so into this guy, honestly. During World War II, Shannon was working on classified communications problems for the U.S. government. He produced a paper on the mathematics of cryptography that was so foundational it's still cited today. Even though it was classified for years after the war ended, and most people never got to read it when it would have made the biggest difference. He was essentially building the mathematical skeleton of the entire information age in parallel, across multiple projects, while also finding time to construct elaborate mechanical toys in his office. Bell Labs at the time was probably the most productive research institution in American history. Even by their standards, Shannon was considered exceptional. He spent his later years at MIT, became a professor, quietly watched the world be rebuilt on top of his ideas without much fanfare or public recognition. He had a few years where his work started getting the respect it deserved within technical communities. But by then, he had mostly retreated from public life. He developed Alzheimer's disease in his final years and passed away in 2001. The obituaries that ran for him in mainstream publications were genuinely embarrassingly short, given what he had actually accomplished. The entire architecture of how we store, send, receive information traces back to what one man worked out at a desk in New Jersey more than 70 years ago. Most people walking around with smartphones in their pockets couldn't pick his face out of a lineup. Every phone, laptop, and wireless device on Earth runs on math Claude Shannon worked out juggling in the hallways of Bell Labs. Most of the people using them have absolutely no idea who he was,